the official book release with Misfit Press here in Shoreditch, London, tomorrow, Friday.
Okay. All right, cool. Okay, we got more people coming in, and I like to keep on schedule. So I said this will be about an hour, so I'm gonna start up. Hello, my name is Julian Chambliss. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of English here at Michigan State University. I'm also the Val Berryman Curator of History at the MSU Museum. I'm here talking with Jon Gosier about his new book, Code Switch. He's messing around with his cell phone. He's joining us from London. We're actually getting access to his book early. If you saw, if you're here, you saw some of the emails I sent around announcing this. Jon has been working in technology and in the African continent and was working on it for many years. Really a pivotal moment in sort of recent sort of technological transformations in terms of internet and crisis communication, mapping, data visualization. Jon has very varied and complex biography, and we're going to get into all of that during this conversation. But his book, Code Switch, Hip Hop Hackers and Africa's Tech Revolution, is really a unique opportunity to talk with someone who's on the ground in that sort of pivotal period in the early aughts through the really to like 2015, 2016, and really still at some level today. But these were pivotal moments when you think about some of the political upheavals, some of the transformations on the ground in places like Uganda, and the work that he did with the groups that he was working with around technology, data, really became part of pivotal narratives of our understanding of technology in Africa. And he's doing this as an American and doing it really, if you read this book, and I really do urge you to read this book, it's really interesting. I will say, Jon, one of the things that I would characterize your book as is a really kind of Afrofuturist narrative. And I want to start out by asking you a little bit about the very first part of the book, where you talk about your origin stories and how you got into technology, and it really relies very heavily on hip hop and your work with music, and how that led you into work with a fairly little known but important filmmaker called Tyler Perry. No, I'm joking. Everybody knows who Tyler Perry is now, but when you started working for him, he was a relatively unknown film producer. And so I just want you to start by talking a little bit about that journey of hip hop and how it sort of set you up on a kind of creative pathway, and how it's sort of a part of your origin story, as it were.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's actually levels to how hip hop relates to this manuscript, and also how it relates to my life, and why I made it such a big theme throughout the book. Number one was it's how I got introduced to technology. I grew up in rural Georgia, and my family's from a farm in deep South Georgia. We moved to Atlanta when I was in the fifth grade, and I didn't really get into music or tech until I was in my late teens, like 16, 17, 18. And then it was through that I got into tech. And the reason why is, at the time, the way that you learned music was not through, or the way that I learned music was not through taking piano lessons or drum lessons or vocal lessons or anything like that. It was, Jon's good at computers. Computers this is again in the early 2000s. Computers are at the center of the recording studio. Me coming out of school around that time, is like, what jobs can I get? There was no film industry in Atlanta. I wasn't good enough at business or anything else to do anything else. So what was I good at? I was good at computers, and I did have a desire at the time to pursue music. So I went to work in recording studios because the computer was the center of the recording studio. Even if you're talking about what producers did at the time, with beat machines, the Akai MPC, TB-303, the all the different tools and technologies that people use to make music. They were all essentially computers. They were either actual computers or they were beat machines and synthesizers and keyboards that were run by computers. And so the person who was the most important in the room was always the most technical. And that was something I had never experienced anywhere else in my life, especially as a Black person, was where, you know, you being the most important person in the room because of your knowledge, because of your ability to manipulate this technology. And so that's how I got into tech. And then through working with some of the artists that I did and some of the studios that I did, it elevated me to sort of being someone who sought after in that industry. And then, you know, that one thing led to another, and that's how I got into programming and software and so many other things. But it started with music. And so I always say everything I learned about tech, business, international business, international socio-economic politics, all of that stuff started with hip hop. The other reason why this is a layer in the book is because of the artists that I work with. You know, you're talking about Kanye West before people knew who that was. Tyler Perry before it, and I was the music supervisor for Tyler Perry. That's why it's, even though he's a filmmaker, for me it was about music. You know, before anybody knew who he was, Outkast, who were very famous at the time, but they relied very heavily upon their technical sort of entourage, and you know, that gave me a lot of ins to the industry and taught me a lot. So
Yeah, I want to follow up on it. Before I do that, I want to tell our audience that if you have questions about Jon, anything Jon's saying, please drop them in the Q&A and I will address them near the end of our conversation. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the early part of your book is that you're using both the sort of, you know, ideas like the kernel and the command line as kind of like thematic through lines. And you talk a little bit about, as you say, the philosophy of hip hop and how it corresponds very closely with the philosophy of technology in a way. And I find that really fascinating because when we're talking about techno culture, and I'm thinking about it in the context of Afrofuturism, I teach a class here about Afrofuturism, and I talk about hip hop as one of the sort of founding fields that is sort of pointing to as an example of Afrofuturist behavior, like the idea of remixing, creating, hacking. These are all ideas that you might think about in the context of code and computers, but they're also really crucial ideas that you think about in the context of hip hop. And you talk very, very strongly about that. And so when people are reading the book, there are these great, and yes, my background is the cover of Jon's book. I am pushing this book very heavily for him. I've known Jon for a long time. Give me a chance to talk to him about this book. And like I said, I've read it. It's a really good book, but it's interesting for that sort of philosophical connection. And I wonder, as you think about what your sort of your pathway in technology, how much did that hip hop idea remain sort of, it seemed like it remained very, very central to how you were thinking about technology, even as you moved through the world in a way. And can you talk a little bit about that, like the way that it sort of hip hop stayed with you in a way?
yeah, so the thing that you're talking about at the very beginning of the book is I compare the idea of what it means to basically program the operating system of the computer from scratch. You start with the kernel. The kernel controls the machine. It's literally called machine language. It tells the computer how to manipulate electricity, and then on top of that, you add code, which tells the computer how to basically interpret that electricity into what we see, what we interact with, how we interface with the computer. And so the idea of that made me think of how in hip hop, it's especially DJing. I used to be a DJ. I was never really a rapper, really did anything in front of the microphone or anything like that. It was always like producer, audio engineer, DJ. I was always the technical person in the room, as I said before. Um, and so I thought about what DJs do. And DJs take something that exists and they manipulate it in order to create a new experience. And so to me, I started writing that chapter about something very different. And then something just kind of resonated. And I was like, well, actually, this is the same thing. It's like you're taking what exists in the case of, machine code and the physical hardware of a computer. Someone else created that. It's not the person who programs it. The person who programs it is essentially a DJ who remixes all of the existing parts and creates a new experience, which we call an operating system. And I wanted to make that point in that chapter. And then also it relates later in the book because the idea of improvisation, the idea of the use of technology, the idea of hip hop as protest and just kind of coloring outside the lines as a form of protest. That's something that became very relevant in my own life when I started to witness the stuff that happened in the Middle East and North Africa and East Africa and West Africa during the late, I guess, 2010s to 2018, that window of 8 years. A lot of interesting things happened in Africa. Whole governments were toppled.
Right.
Political status quo in multiple countries changed. And I saw the activist movement as being equally innovative, being able to adapt to all the different changes in their surroundings and so forth. So it's in many ways the idea of the kernel, the idea of the very basics of computer technology and hip hop became like a triple entendre. It's talking about actual making music. It's also talking about how technology is created. And on top of that, it's also talking about how digital activists use those technologies to affect the world around them.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. This book is a kind of narrative of your journey through life. And after that those initial chapters where you're talking about your experiences and with sound, you talk about eventually deciding not to do it anymore. And you have a really interesting set of conversations about trap music and some of the independent stuff that you were doing. But I'm one other thing that comes through, because from your experience working in music studios in Atlanta, you started to travel. And you talk very openly about your love of travel and really being not necessarily a digital vagabond, but you were just a backpack on the road, going places, sleeping, sleeping on the street sometimes. I had not known this about you. And one of the things that came through in that, and it sort of corresponds to the early part of your life, is the way that you were able to connect with people two ways. One, in the sort of relationships you created in computer spaces, right? Like that you talked about kind of forming bonds with people and talk about freaking, which is, and unless you're reading like old school hacking histories, most people don't remember freaking. Like, but you talked about it, and I was really struck by that. But you also talked about the relationships that are formed in chat rooms and on message boards, especially in that early 2000 period. And you make a point of saying that was a way of moving past the differences that people had and really locking in on sort of shared interests and shared philosophies, as it were. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, because of course in our contemporary landscape, we look to the online environment and see the ways that it fractures people. But you're really talking about, from your own experience, perhaps maybe a different time, but as a person of color, traveling the world, being able to connect with some of these people that you knew only through virtual means, and them helping you in your travel. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that philosophy, as you know, again, from the perspective of African American. That's not often how we are. That's not often the narrative about technology that people are able to articulate, right? Like, we're left out of that version of some of these conversations.
Yeah, what I can say about that is and I didn't really realize this at the time. It's one of those things that you think about in hindsight, but I would not have experienced the world the way that I did. I wouldn't have had the courage to just go and live in Europe for a number of months. I wouldn't have had the courage to go move to Africa. I wouldn't have had the courage to interact with people in the way that I did if it had not been for the fact that I was able to connect with most of these people and places through technology before I got there. Right, because the world, especially if you grow up like I did, and my mom's from a rural farm and a farm in South Georgia. Um, she grew. I was just talking about this at dinner. She grew up pre-civil rights era, right? Like she was in her 20s when Dr. King was assassinated. So in many ways, like represent in the book, there's a chapter called Boomer. It's all about my mom. She's a baby boomer. There's no insult in that. It's just like what it is. And the thing that I recognized about the world that she grew up in is that she was very fearful of the world, rightfully so. She saw all her political heroes, whether it's Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, or any number of other people, Sam Cooke. They were all either assassinated or died prematurely from suspicious circumstances, to say the least. And so for her, the world was a scary place. You just keep your head low and you just do what you need to do to survive, and you don't make a whole lot of noise or draw attention to yourself. And I realized that I never grew up with that fear, because when I was 13 or 14, 15, AOL chat rooms popped up, and I could meet people all over the planet. And, you start with age, sex, location, then you go into your interests, and then you start chatting with someone, and all of a sudden you have an understanding about someone who you've never met before. Maybe you're talking to a catfish, but at the time that wasn't as prevalent as it is now. But my point is, you're able to build experiences without ever going anywhere. And so when it came time to me being 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, in hindsight, I realized I didn't have the fear of stepping out and interacting with the world in a certain way, because in many ways, technology had taught me that people are always open to connecting. Uh, whether this is true or not, I didn't believe the world was as scary as I think older, people who came before me did. So, I don't think I'm articulating it very well, but I think there's something about technology that lowered the fear threshold to just get out and try things. And in some ways, that's the way most people learn technology. Like, most people don't learn by being taught, like, here's what you do, here's how this works, here's how this works. Most people learn by trying and failing and trying and failing and trying. They just try, whether you're starting with your iPhone or whether you're starting with a Commodore 64. Either way, you learn to just appreciate that technology is always going to give you the feedback, and you're going to learn from it. You don't need other people's opinions. You don't need the outside knowledge. And that's the way I just learned to interact with the world. So
Right.
that's what I take away from that.
I really appreciate your perspective on that. As I say, I think it's interesting to read about that kind of transformative access that I think a lot of people associated with this early web 1.0, like a lot of our hopes for what the internet was supposed to be able to do were sort of encapsulated in some of the things that you were describing. But I want to move on to your move to Africa. as you document in the book, you once again made the decision to transition, in part because of your partner at the time who worked in sort of like international nonprofits, and you're already established travel bug, and you decide, hey, I think she gets a job, and you're willing to go with her, and you end up going to Uganda, and that really starts the process of your work. And again, code switching is a recurring theme, and you talk about yourself as a code switcher, interacting with code switchers in Africa, and really discovering a kind of hidden pool of talent, but really a complicated set of actions that grew out of like your position as an expat who had some understanding of technical spaces, and there are a number of different endeavors that you embark upon that really put you at the center of an emerging technoculture in Africa, and really put you in a position of doing some really important work. And I'm thinking particularly of Africa. Is that the
Africa?
Africa. So can you explain what that was and how it operated and why it's so important in terms of, because you did a lot under that rubric, first as a blogger, it seems, and then increasingly in terms of like organizing a company that's about technology, and really fighting a kind of global sort of stereotype about Africa as a place where there is no technology, or people who are not technical. And you were really at the forefront and got about that.
Yeah, I mean, so you touch on why I wrote this book. I mean, there was a number of reasons, but the main reason was when I look at contemporary history, especially when I look at academic history, I don't see a whole lot of information about contemporary Africa, especially as it relates to technology. And so that was bizarre to me, because this is what I lived and breathed for at least nearly 5 years of my life. It was, like the digital humanities of Africa. And I didn't even know it was called digital humanities. That's something I learned from you. But living there, being there, breathing, hanging out with these people, breaking bread with these people, and starting companies, or sometimes going through tragic events with these people, I was just like, how is it that Africa is still seen as basically villages and huts? And yet some of the most technical, some of the most sophisticated operations I've ever been a part of in my life, and I still to this day stand by that. I'm still very much in the tech space, still building software companies, still working with VCs and big enterprises around the world. Yet some of the experiences I had in Africa are just like remarkable, still remarkable in my mind, for how sophisticated, for how elegant solutions they were, and how well they worked in these dire times that people faced. It was remarkable to me that none of that seemed to be documented, appreciated, and recorded. And something that you hear a lot when you're in Africa is an old adage which says, the reason why, people don't know the history of whatever is because history is written by the winners. I mean, you don't know about all the tribes that were conquered, or the people throughout history that have been subjugated by an oppressor, because whoever ends up being that oppressor, they tend to rewrite history to suit their narrative. I mean, the best example is probably the King James Bible. That's not the original Bible. It's just not. People can choose to believe what they want to believe, but when you start digging into history, it's like the people who have power at the time can sometimes rewrite the narrative to suit their desire. And I just thought it was important not to rewrite history, but to make a contribution to history that highlights these efforts, these people, these movements, because they were very real. They're very important to me, and they're very important, I think, to a continent of 1 billion people. And unfortunately, that continent doesn't have a whole lot of people at the table writing history. So I thought it was extra important for me to document all of this.
So to that end, your first start, you talk about hanging out with a number of people who are writing about politics, writing about technology, and you're finding your way, and you start a company, Africa, and that company it does a lot. I mean, it's really interesting because you're connecting Facebook early on to programmers and developers in Africa. You're helping. You're going on sort of VC trips and attracting investors and really sort of making the argument there are people in Africa who can produce work. And so I want you to talk specifically about the early time with that company and what was you talk a lot about it in the book, but I know for people who haven't, this is a really unique opportunity for you to sort of like sort out like this is what we were trying to do, and this is the challenge that we ran into. And I think there are a number of times throughout the narrative when you're talking about it that you're really overcoming these deep rooted assumptions that there is no talent in Africa. Like that's a recurring theme. Like that happens every other chapter. In this section, like this person doesn't believe there's where are you going to get the equipment? I mean, that one was a little bit more complicated, but there was just like these fundamental things like you can't do that here. And you were saying, no, you can. And you really become a vehicle for proving to people that you can. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about what that was like and some of the people you work with.
Yeah, I mean, so all that stemmed from my own personal bias. So I moved to Africa, so I mean, one of the things early on in the book, I go to Europe and I'm working with these digital freakers, as you called them, right? I mean, that's the name of the movement, freakers. So by the way, for fun fact for everyone listening, Steve Wozniak, who started Apple Computers, was probably the biggest freaker and one of the most notorious
Right.
from that community. And he somehow evaded jail and instead created this multi-billion-dollar company.
Just so people know,
that was the original hackers. That was the original hackers. Before hackers existed, freakers were people who manipulated phones to do what you see on TV when people are manipulating computers. But, in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, you didn't have, digital connections. You had analog connections through phones, and people could manipulate the phones and the electricity to do all the things that we now glorify computer hackers for doing. And so in some ways it was the most hardcore type of hacking because it was like, I mean, you're literally manipulating switchboards and electricity and tones. And it was incredible. I mean, it was incredible for me to kind of go back and relearn that history. But I do remember growing up and reading about them in the same way that people who grew up, in the 90s probably read about, the computer hackers of the era. So that was one thing. But to go back to your question about what it meant for Africans and why that was so passionate, why I was so passionate about that is because I had spent time in Europe and I had spent time with people who were brilliant with technology, doing things that people thought weren't possible. And then I got to Uganda and I went there with all these presumptions about what Africa would be like. I was not someone who knew a lot about Africa. No one, I'm not African. I didn't have any context. All I knew was my girlfriend was going there for her humanitarian job. And when I ended up there, I started Africa, which originally was going to be basically a web design company. All I was trying to do is make websites. Then I got there and then I would walk into rooms and I'm like, okay, I want to make your website. And people are like, well, we don't need that, but we need, corporations. When I say people, corporations like Google, Facebook, Twitter, banks, telecoms, etc. They were like, look, we don't need a website, especially not for this part of the world. What we need is technology tools that get us more audience, get us more market share, in this part of the world like we have in Europe and like we have in North America. And so I was like, okay, that can't be that hard. And so I would take the contracts, not really knowing what I didn't know. And then I would get like this complicated, um, deliverable. And then I was like, okay, I don't know how to do any of this. So then I started to look around me for anyone who could build it. I was in Uganda and I was like, well, there's got to be smart people here who know how to do this stuff. So then I went to the local university and I started to meet kids who knew how to do it. And the thing, it's not that they knew how to do it. The thing that really made me passionate about this entire space was they were some of the most impressive people that I had, and although I'm a technical person, but I'm not like a Steve Wozniak level technical person. Like I can observe that people are brilliant in technology, but I can't do the brilliance. I can just observe it. And so like I was an observer of brilliance. And then I was in this environment where every day I was like, this person is like making like something out of nothing. Like it was brilliant. It really humbled me. And I was in awe of the level of intelligence of people that I met there. And I just thought it was such an injustice that I would sit in these meetings and they would talk about how there was no talent around. It made me mad. I was like, no, like you don't understand. Like these people are brilliant. You're underselling them. Like I can't let this be. And so that's really what fueled Africa. Africa was a consultancy. It wasn't like a products company. It didn't do one thing. It was essentially a problem solving organization like a McKinsey or a Deloitte, at a much smaller scale. But that's how we got involved in all these different things. And that's why throughout the book, you hear about all these different technologies that came out of Africa, because one of the things that I adopted very early on was I would invest in the people who worked for the company. If they had ideas that I were like, look, I mean, you've got a brilliant idea. I don't know how to help you make that happen, but I know that it needs to exist. And, I'm in a position to control some money. So I would put money towards other people's ideas. And so I think somewhere in the book, I call it the house of ideas. I mean, that's what it was. I mean, that's why, I don't know, maybe 20 chapters out of a 30 chapter book talk about some innovation that came from someone within the company, so anyway, that was the spirit of the company. And that's why it was so important for me to double down on that. And that's how the book culminates as well.
And there are two things in this sort of early period that when you're talking about Africa and the way that it's approaching its work. One, mobility or the mobile phone is the platform, excuse me, that allow the technology solutions and the problems when you talk about market share. It is the mobile platform that is this really pervasive and penetrating in Africa. And almost all the projects that you talked about were about trying to allow a kind of low bandwidth, what you describe as a low bandwidth environment, connecting with these emerging internet websites like a Facebook or like a Google or whatever. So the mobile platform was a platform you guys were designing for. And as you were become more and more successful, one of the things that you hit upon, and now it seems very, very common, but you started with some of the first co-working spaces in Africa. They became like a series of them around the continent. And that became like Collab, I think it was called Collab. And that was another one of the sort of like
Hive, Collab, and Afrolabs.
Yeah. So those were some of the first ones ever in Africa, the ones that you created. I think you describe as like the second one ever in Africa was the one that you made, or the third one or something like that. And from those,
yeah. So oops, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, there was a bit of a delay. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. It's okay. I was just wanting you to talk about the co-working projects that spun out of that.
So So the reason why co-working was important is because number one, co-working did not exist when I moved to Africa. So people think of WeWork as either the first or the most successful co-working space. Um, it was neither. It's not neither. It's not the most successful. Well, I mean, I guess that's debatable, depends on how you look at it. But it definitely wasn't the first. And the first space that I remember in Africa that was doing something like what became the co-working movement around the world was a group called Active Spaces, and I believe they're based out of Senegal. And so that's why Hive Collab was not it just wasn't the first. I was inspired by the Active Spaces group, and then the third one that I remember was called iHub, which is based out of Kenya, and then there was a litany of others over the coming years. Now there's probably 600 across the African continent. Um, but at the beginning, the reason why it was so important is because one, it was a place where people in country, entrepreneurs, creators, inventors could come. They had access to, they didn't have to pay rent. They had access to electricity, consistent electricity, stable electricity. They had access to fast internet, and they had access to an ecosystem of other brilliant people that did not exist in these countries before co-working spaces. So it seems very small. It's like something that's easily forgettable. But at the time in 2008, 2009, 2010, this was groundbreaking for Africa. Um, and then also you got to remember, WeWork didn't really take off until 2010, maybe 2009. So even the idea of co-working was new to the world, but Africa was at the forefront of that movement. Technically, Regis was way ahead of everyone. Regis has been around for like 30 years at that point, but not in the way that co-working became a thing throughout the world. So that was one reason. The other reason was co-working was the onboarding point for foreigners, especially foreign investors who are interested in African innovation and investment opportunities. Because if you think about it, if you're in Manhattan and you want to get on a plane and go to Nigeria or Ghana or Uganda or Kenya or Zimbabwe or Egypt or wherever, how do you know who to talk to? I mean, you might have a relationship. How do you know that person's authentic? How do you know you're not being scammed? How do you know the reputations of the people if you have never set foot on the continent before? And so the co-working space, what we call the hub, the innovation hub movement of Africa, was really the entry point for a lot of foreign investors to better learn and understand and interact with the African market without having to get on a plane and go there. Many of them would come after they had that first touch point, but this was like their first touch. It helped them understand the ecosystem. And in some cases, they could stay where they were and they trust the network and they would invest through the network. In other cases, they would get on a plane, they would come and they would interact with folks, but they'd have a much better experience because they had the sort of social fabric that AfriLabs presented them. Because, I mean, it's a network of entrepreneurs, investors, stakeholders, politicians, et cetera, all of whom are African. And it was aggregating all that knowledge so that foreign people could, just rely on this one group as opposed to having to meet all these different people throughout the continent.
Right. And after the sort of success of that consultancy, you next started getting involved with the company whose name I'm going to butcher if I try to say it. So you say it.
Ushahidi.
Ushahidi. Okay. All right.
Ushahidi. Yeah.
Ushahidi. Okay. Which, if people know you from anything, I think they know you from the impact of that platform. Can you describe that platform for people and how it was implemented first in sort of crises in places like Haiti, but also a lot of the sort of like social upheavals that happened in Uganda and Kenya, and that really sort of crystallized you. It brought a lot of attention to the way that you were using technology and data to sort of help people in moments of crisis around the world.
Yeah. So Ushahidi was it's hard to describe, but it was a beast at the time. It was the African export that was celebrated by everyone. It's bizarre to me that people don't talk about Ushahidi anymore, because from 2007 to 2014, it seemed like that's all people talked about as it related to tech in Africa was Ushahidi. It was the first, even though it was a nonprofit company, in many ways, it was the first successful African tech startup to translate abroad. And the way it translated abroad was because it made crisis response technology. That was their mission as Ushahidi. Started during 2007 election crisis, which in Kenya, which nearly threw the country into civil war, the likes of which Africa hadn't seen since Rwanda in the late 90s. So that was what was at risk in 2007 in Kenya. A lot of people, a lot of Kenyans, a lot of people in the international community credit Ushahidi for preventing that sort of just breakdown in society, because they made these tools to help people during that time of disaster. After that, they were met with lots of awards, lots of funding, lots of support from around the world, from people who recognize the importance of what they did in Kenya in 2007. And then that was then exported to other places. So in 2010, when there was these devastating earthquakes that destroyed Haiti, and Ushahidi was one of the tools that, and another group called Frontline SMS. These were the tools that were used to essentially first responder tools used to respond to people who were affected directly during those times of disaster in Haiti, later in Japan after the nuclear fallout of Fukushima, in Queensland, Australia during the floods, in Christchurch, New Zealand, there was flooding and earthquakes there. So basically, from 2008 to 2012, while I was still involved with Ushahidi one way or the other, all the world's biggest global disasters, they were there. They were one of the first tools used to respond. And that's what they were famous for, was building tools to respond to disaster that got used over and over again. The reason why that was unprecedented was it was unprecedented at the time, and arguably still, for a group of Kenyans to be coordinating these rescue relief efforts around the world, directing the Red Cross, the US Army, the United Nations, the World Bank. Like, the most powerful organizations on the planet are relying on these 5 Kenyans, or people of Kenyan descent, who were in Kenya at the time. And that was incredibly powerful. And so you talked about sort of like my notoriety and how I kind of rose to notoriety. Initially, it was all because of Ushahidi. I mean, it's why I became a TED Fellow. It's why I was kind of on the world stage at a young age. And I recognized that. And then over the years, as that organization sort of went in other ways, like I said, it became baffling to me that it just seemed like all of this had, and like, you remember, I don't know, like you're watching like Ghostbusters or something, and like everyone gets back together years later, and they're like, you remember this thing that happened? And then it's like nobody remembers that it happened, and then all of a sudden, like, that becomes like the catalyst for a whole bunch of new stuff to happen. And or maybe like It is a better example. All these kids come back together when they're older, and they remember all this stuff they did when they were younger. And I'm just like, this stuff happened. It's real. It's important. And I personally didn't want to let the world forget about it. So that was a big motivator in writing this book and working on some of the other things that I am.
And just to let people know, the
It's
platform.
also what I gave my TED talk about in
2009, right?
2014. Well, I gave my first one in 2009, but the popular one, the 2014.
Yeah. And this platform, it's really described as a platform allowed people to send information about a crisis in real time. And that information was verifiable through a series of like sort of technical processes. And so what it was often described at the time as like crisis mapping, because in the middle of some of these crises, you didn't have a way to understand what was going on. And this tool allowed you to do that. And it was deployed, as you say, over and over again to great effect, because in the midst of really horrible things with huge human death tolls, getting resources to the places where they were needed were really the difference between life and death. And over again,
Yeah, I mean, you
all attention to how this helped us do that, right?
yeah, I mean, you can think of it as a combination of Twitter and Google Maps. Twitter, you can say like you can post whatever information you want. Google Maps puts it on a map, and then you can go there. And also the other reason why all of this is important is because it was an open source community. A lot of the people who invented these tools and technologies, they just did it for the good of humanity. Ushahidi was a nonprofit organization. No one really profited off of all of this. However, all the people who invented this stuff then went to work for Google and Twitter and Facebook. And so it is not insignificant that these technologies were created in 2009, 2010, 2011, and then went on to make their way into your Instagrams, your Foursquares, your Facebooks. It's the same people. It's just they all eventually moved on and found a way to make money. But it all started in Africa. And that's something else that I don't want people to forget is like these things that people take for granted on a day-to-day basis. Where do they come from? And people are like, oh, some guy in Mountain View created this. It's like, no, that guy in Mountain View was working with these guys in Kenya in 2009. I know, I was there. And that is a big part of the knowledge that I wanted to just kind of leave behind, because at the end of the day, it's like, history is in many ways like a word game. It's like whoever writes the most, that's what's going to be the history. But if it's not written at all, no one can give credit to the Kenyans or to the whoever the underdog is. And so it's not to say that a lot of innovation hasn't happened elsewhere. It's just that Africa made a contribution. Let's celebrate Africa's contribution to the technology that we all use and love around the world. It's not taking anything away from anyone to do that.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. I think one of the things about the sort of like next part of your book and it's sort of getting towards your contemporary moment is that while the organization you were part of gained a lot of attention very quickly as a TED speaker, a TED fellow. I remember you were at TED Global at one point. You really started to warn about the ways that technology may not necessarily have all the positive outcomes if the ideology behind it isn't sort of geared towards helping people. And your TED Talk, The Danger of Trickle-Down Technology, is one of my favorites, in part because like the simple idea is like, technical tools aren't, there still has to be people and a vision that recognizes people's humanity connected to the tools. And it was interesting because one of the ways that you were recognized and the organization you were working with recognized were by journalist organizations like the Knight Foundation, things like this. And you were often in sort of paired with in a lot of public narratives with this sort of idea of like technology and democratizing information in an era of sort of like sunshine and things like that. And I wonder, as you think about your past and sort of contemporary debates about technology, what are some of the lessons that you wish people would learn in terms of the way technology is brought to bear for some of these broad social and democratic questions?
My message is often for the other engineers, the people who make technology, because in some ways the general public, you can't control how the person who makes the tools then uses the tools, right? Like they're the maker of the tool. You're kind of subject to what they do. However, if you're the tool maker, if you're the engineer, if you're the software designer, and you're making these technologies, what I observed, and I observed this long before 2016, when I think it kind of went off the rails, was people sort of just making technology, and it's like, oh yeah, it could be used for that, but no one's going to do that. You know, they kind of take for granted this idea that they have that everything's just going to work out fine. And I just thought it was so reckless for people who create things to not then take responsibility for the things that they were creating. And that really culminated for me in 2015, 2016, 2017, the presidential election of that era, where arguably tools were used for disinformation to make one political candidate look bad or worse, and to make another look like they were just part of more of a groundswell movement, which they may have been. But the use of technology during the time to manipulate the public is documented. Like it's not like this didn't happen. So it's documented by the intelligence community, by anecdote, and then I think by the admission of the people who did it later, which would be the Russian hackers. And the goal was to get people to essentially vote one way versus vote another way. And regardless of what your political beliefs are, that's a dangerous precedent to set. Now, it's not new to the world. People could go back in history and find ways that America did this way before technology and manipulated other people's elections and did disinformation and so forth, or other countries or other regimes or whatever. But I think the danger is heightened by the fact that tech and data allows all this to happen much faster and at much a wider scale. And so the reason why 2016 was important to me was not because of how the election turned out, but it was because I recognized the recipes of what was happening before it turned out the way that it did. And I was like, wait a minute, like I lived in Uganda during 2 presidential election cycles. I know what disinformation looks like. I know what a totalitarian government looks like. I know what social engineering looks like. And I had been one of the uses of Ushahidi throughout many years was for election monitoring and protecting elections in democracies around the world. So I had seen disinformation in other countries, Nigeria, Egypt, other parts of the world where democracy is fragile. And I guess the point there in the chapters that talk about this is for the people who make technologies that can be misused to just stay vigilant and aware of their potential misuse, because you're not absolved just because you're not the person who uses it to hurt people or to. I don't believe you're absolved because you're not the person who uses the tool to hurt people. You made the tool, you know its potential uses, and if you take that for granted, that is recklessness. And it doesn't make you the person who pulled the trigger, but it makes you the person who didn't care one way or the other.
When you're thinking about your current work, I know you've sort of almost come full circle, and I want to give you a chance to talk about some of your current ventures in terms of filmmaking and working in Atlanta. But if you, and I saw like one of your last TED Talks was exactly about this. It was about this idea that we have a responsibility to understand the ways that technology are affecting society, and the biases and abuses. That's the responsibility of people making the technology. If there was something you could say in terms of creating policy, how would you approach it? Like, what would you say to people? Like what's the best way to incentivize this better kind of behavior? Is it just simply appealing to people's better nature, or are there solid things that we can do to like get these outcomes that we know are better for things like democracy, things like civil society?
Well, I think building technology starts with intention. I don't trust any technologist who says, "Oh, I'm just building this just because I want to build it." Like there is always an intention, and that intention is either going to be a net positive for the world or it's going to be a net negative. As a technologist, you have to own that. You have to call it out, and it's not that it has to be a positive. It could be whatever, but like don't pretend to be agnostic, as a technologist. Like I think that's a real danger. The second thing is I think policymakers should incorporate the people who make technology in designing policy. And I think it should not be a suggestion. I think it should be a requirement. It's like if we're making laws about the way social media affects society, all the social media companies should be at the table. They should all be forced to take a stance one way or the other on what they want their tools to, how they want their tools to interact with people in the world. Like it's only fair. Like we're all stakeholders in society. It doesn't make sense to me for some stakeholders, especially ones with lots of power, to act like they don't have that power. It doesn't make sense to me. It's like if you're TikTok, you've got a lot of power. You got it to, and I think that's right. I think it's foolish to pretend like these things happen in a vacuum. And I think the best example of that over the past 6 years has been the best example of why that doesn't work is how Facebook has handled the past 6, 7 years of its life. It just, it existed, and the powers that be pretended like this isn't part of the social fabric of society. I mean, I'm sorry, but you're so successful that you're part of the social fabric of society. That comes with a certain level of responsibility. And they just never wanted to own that. And I feel like they should have been forced to a long time ago. And now that they are, it's like they're trying to do whatever they can to get out of being in that position to have that power. I don't think the whole metaverse thing Facebook did was an accident. I don't think Zuckerberg's an idiot. I think he doesn't want the responsibility of running Facebook in the way that it existed up until 2020.
Okay. I do want to, in this last few minutes, like we can go a little longer because we start a little later. If people have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. I want to thank Jennifer for reminding people you can ask questions. Now you are working in, you're still doing venture capitalist stuff. What would you say is the sort of technological outlook in terms of Africa right now? Because obviously, you remain sort of connected to the communities of practice you were connected to previously. You're still doing the sort of venture capitalist thing. How would you talk about Africa now in 2023 in terms of like these sort of technical questions and technoculture questions? Is it better? About the same?
It's a lot better.
Okay.
No, it's a lot better. So the reason why I became a venture capitalist, this was while I was in Africa, in Uganda, was because I recognized that the people who made, like, no change was going to happen without money, and the people who controlled the money could decide the change that was going to happen. And so the one area of finance that I could get into as someone who didn't go to business school, who didn't have the pedigree to do, government policy stuff, venture capital is the Wild West. Anybody can be a VC. So I was like, I'm a technologist. I'm fairly successful. I'm going to be a VC. I started a fund and started investing in African tech companies. The sorry, give me 1 second.
Yeah. Uh-oh. Well, I think
I apologize. I apologize. So the idea of being a VC for me was power. It was power to control the narrative of what was important, what was innovative, and what was necessary to Africa's future. This was 15 years ago. Fast forward 15 years, I'm no longer in Africa, but I think the legacy that was laid by AfriLabs, by my peers at Ushahidi, by my peers at Frontline SMS, by my friends in all the activist communities of Africa, not all of them have reaped the benefits of all that work. However, the legacy of what they laid was Africa is an environment where you can do business. And Africa now is one of the fastest growing markets for venture capital in the world. And I do not think that would be the case if it weren't be for the work that this group of people, which I happen to be a part of, but it wasn't my work, it was our work, laid the groundwork for. And I believe that. And it's almost like, like I'm not a parent, but I imagine it's what being a parent is like, in that, it's like whatever you did in your lifetime, you want to see the people who come after you, you want to see your kids, you want to see your grandkids go so much further. And I just look at Africa now and I'm just like amazed at the heights at which things have kind of elevated to. It's really exciting and really incredible.
okay. I know that we are catching you. I should say that John is on his cell phone. That's why he's moving around. Because as we said at the very
Yeah,
beginning,
sorry.
the book launch is tomorrow for this book. If you want to know more about Code Switch, you can go to Code Switch. Is it codeswitch.com?
It's codeswitchbook.com.
Codeswitchbook.com and check out the snazzy cover that you see behind me. Unless it's changed, I think it's still that same color, right? I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. There is so much in this book, it was impossible. We were not going to cover all of it, but I hope you get the sense that the sort of life story, the sort of story of his journey in technology, the way it intersects with Africa really does intersect with a lot of the pivotal moments in the last, especially the last 15 years in terms of technoculture and really changing some of our understandings about Africa as a technology space. And I think you'll always have some really important insights gleaned if you read this book, just about the nature of some of the sort of text-based and mobility, so innovations that were really key to the technoculture scene in Africa. So I wish you luck.
And one thing I wanted to add, Julian, is one of the reasons why I bonded with you many years ago was over lots of things, comic books, right? In the book, you see lots of illustrations because I was like, this is a part of the world people don't necessarily know what it looks like. They don't know what things are like. So I wanted to have illustrations to kind of ground the story. But the other thing was the idea of Afrofuturism. And I was like, that's great. Like I am an Afrofuturist. However, I was also like, what about Africa present? Like this is now, this is history, this is recent. And I really, I can't highlight enough the fact that there's such an absence of recent African innovations to anything. And it doesn't mean that they aren't there. They're just not documented. And so this is one of the books that aims to document those contributions. And hopefully there are many more.
Right. And for everybody who tuned in today, I really appreciate the comments from my colleagues here. They're just saying nice things and I ask them questions, just saying nice things. I appreciate that. But again, check out John's book. I'm sure there's going to be a bit of a press tour for this book. I know London's the opening gambit, but you'll be back in the US. And I think you said Atlanta for your second sort of like date.
Yeah.
Right. And Atlanta's
We'll
also,
do a bit of,
keep going.
I was just going to say we'll do a bit of a book tour, but London's first because the publisher's based here in London, and then I am going to do Atlanta because I'm from Atlanta, and then from there it's just kind of wherever it takes us.
And I should give you a moment to talk a little bit about your current sort of film company and the movie based on this book. Let's talk about that just for a second, because I don't want you to leave here pretending that this book's not going to be a movie. Because we know I've seen the stories about this book is the basis of the movie that you're directing, right? Aha, yes. Let's talk about
That's great. Yeah. So, number one, I mean, although it's a memoir, I see this book as an observer story. I see myself as the observer for a lot of critical history. The thing that the movie does, the film is trying to do, is in an entertaining way, right? So it's based on real events, based on all the same stuff, but it cuts out all the parts that don't matter, mainly my life, and it focuses on the history and the critical events that happen and dramatizes them for the screen. And it follows a group of protagonists who are based on a lot of the characters you read about in the book. But what you have to do in film is you've got to simplify things. Like a book, I can go into detail about all these events and all these places and all these, how all this stuff intersects, and it's intellectually stimulating to see how all this stuff connects. You can't do that in a film, right? You'll lose everyone unless it's a documentary. And so for a narrative film, I had to distill it into something that is more digestible. And so it's about a smaller group that does all these things and to equal effect, but it's not like the book was adapted directly. We took the midsection of the book and we dramatized it and we made it into something else. And that's why the book and the film don't share the same name, because I wanted to signal to people that this isn't the same story. It's inspired by the book, but it's not the movie of the book.
Okay. I stand corrected, because I was assuming that Michael B. Jordan was playing you in this movie. But, obviously.
I mean, he's a little too in demand, but we went after his peers. I'm not going to mention any of them because I don't want to get sued, but pretty much anybody else who would be mentioned alongside his name, we talked to them about being the lead.
Okay. And when is this movie coming out? I saw that it was in production, but I'm not sure.
We're shooting now, and realistically, it's probably going to be mid next year before it's out. And then your other question was about
your new company, film.
Everything else I do outside of that. So related to the film that I'm working on, I finance movies. I started a company called Film Hedge. Film Hedge exists to finance feature films in the $5 to $50 million range. And we've been around for about 3 years now. We've quietly done 20 movies to date. We raised quite a bit of money, $100 million, and we've got a lot more that we plan to announce soon.
That's awesome. And if you want to follow your work, what's your website? It's the same website, right?
It's just gosier.org, GOSIER.org. Or you can follow me on Twitter, JONGOS at Gmail, at JONGOS. Email jongos@gmail.com. And then the websites that you can follow both these projects on are southboxent.com for all the film stuff, and filmhedge.com for all the film finance stuff.
All right. Again, I appreciate you taking the time. Have fun at this book premiere in London, and I wish you a lot of success. I know this was a labor of love for you. And again, I think it's a fascinating book and really does shed light, as you intended, on the technological innovations that really helped define an era, I think, in terms of digital. Some conversation about civil technology and liberatory narratives. And as I say, I think it's a bit of an Afrofuturist tale. So for all those people who are interested in Africa and technology narratives, this is a really informative read. And for anyone interested in sort of breaking down some of our assumptions about the way that Black people engage in techno culture, it is also a really interesting narrative. So again, good luck with this, Jon. I really appreciate your writing on this.
Well, thank you so much. And the last thing I would say is I want to point attention to the communities that all of this activity still thrives in. So hivecollab.com, afrilabs.com, AFRILABS.com, the libertarian tech community. That's where more of the digital activists live. And yeah, I mean, those communities are still alive and active. So I encourage people to discover those too. And thank you, Julian, for having me.
All right, good night, and thank you for our audience. Really appreciate you sticking with us as we ran over. And of course, thank you to my graduate assistant here, Jennifer, who has been doing the hard work of posting these links to everything that Jon has been talking about. As I say, this is a great conversation for us to have. And good night.